Flying over southeastern Ohio and northern West Virginia, you can almost see what this region looked like back in late 1774. Just virgin forest with very little habitation. But events would take place here that would contribute to the Revolutionary War less than 2 years later. Those events include what is now known as Lord Dunmore's War and the Fort Gower Resolves.
November 5th, 2024 is the 250th anniversary of an event known today as the Fort Gower Resolves. And that was sort of the culminating event in an episode called Lord Dunmore's War that occurred in the autumn of 1774. It's hard to say when it started. It may have actually, some of the events probably were precipitated as early as 1763 with the proclamation of 1763 where Britain designated a line that ran along the summit of the Appalachian Mountains as the proclamation line, and theoretically European settlers were not supposed to go beyond that line to settle any land, and the rest of that land west of that would be native land, and it was a good distance from the Ohio River. But it seems like right away settlers started encroaching on that, and of course no one put a line up there. It was just described. And so it seems as though anybody who was interested in moving west decided where they thought that line was and established their own perception on it, and so settlements started encroaching on the Ohio River probably immediately and consistently up until this event. And so in April of 1774, Chief Logan, he's referred to as a Mingo chief, but he was of the Seneca Nation, and he had grown up in the area we know today as upstate New York, and his father got along quite well with European settlers, and Logan did as well. At some point, as encroachment kept occurring, Native American tribes, lots of tribes, got pushed further and further west until a lot of them found themselves in the Ohio country. And Logan and his family were located along the Ohio River, on the Ohio side of the river, which was Native American territory at the time. And up near where today we have Steubenville, and his family members were moving down the Ohio River and were coaxed over to the Virginia side. This is long before West Virginia existed, so it was, some folks were on the Virginia side settled in there. And it was not a settlement, it was more of a campsite, it seems. And Daniel Greathouse and his brother and some other frontiersmen were there, and they invited Logan's family and who all was ever with them over to engage in some sporting events, shooting and what have you. And at some point they got the liquor out, and I guess anybody could fall prey to the liquor, and so probably some of the Native American men drank some of that liquor, and probably it's not exactly sure how all the events transpired there, but at some point the Greathouse and his gang had the Native Americans shoot first at the targets, and then of course when all their weapons were unloaded, they were turned upon, and all of them were slaughtered. And one of the women was pregnant, and they believe they did some pretty nasty things to her and to the child that they ripped out, and pretty severe treatment of the Native Americans, and they were all killed. So Logan's family's massacred along the Ohio River on the Virginia side, and he retaliated. Meanwhile, back east, You have folks like Lord Dunmore. He was a Scottish earl. He had been appointed governor of New York, and then he was moved down to Virginia, something he apparently wasn't very happy about, but he was then governor of both New York and Virginia. And he was looking at land out here in the Ohio country. So was George Washington and a number of other people. And when you have massacres going on out here, that's not really good for real estate development, you might say. And so Dunmore figured he had to put down this uprising, as he saw it, by Logan and any others that were killing whites in Indian territory. And so he organized an army, one wing of which he led down the Ohio River from Fort Pittsburgh, and I believe while he was there he renamed Fort Pitt Fort Dunmore. It didn't hold that name very long. And then another army under Colonel Andrew Lewis organized at a place called Camp Union in Virginia. And they came down the Greenbrier River to the New River and on to the Kanawha River. And when you look into this, it seems like the story has a number of variations. Seemed as though the plan was that Dunmore would meet up with Lewis and his division of the army at Point Pleasant, where the Kanawha River flows into the Ohio. For whatever reason, when Dunmore got down the river, his wing of the army stopped at the mouth of the Hocking River, and they built a fort to leave their supplies and canoes there. And that division of the army marched up the Hocking River. Today we're at the near the confluence of the Hocking River, where it flows into the Ohio River. And in 1774, Lord Dunmore brought his army down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh, and when he got to the Hocking, they got out and built a fort here, Fort Gower. Some folks put Fort Gower down on the floodplain along the Ohio River. Another historian puts it up on this hilltop away from the river along the Hocking here. He felt that the fort would have been built up on a hilltop because it was going to be a place where they left their canoes and some supplies when they headed up the Hocking River into the wilderness. They didn't know how long they'd be gone, so it'd be kind of risky leaving your large canoes down on the floodplain, not knowing whether the weather might change and a flood might occur and run off with your canoes. So if you have 12 to 1,500 soldiers, might not be that difficult of an order to have them drag those canoes up onto the hill and build the fort up on a hill. A fort on a hill gives you a little bit better perspective on the surrounding landscape as well. They could see down the Hocking a bit and the Ohio from here. Whereas down on the floodplain of the Ohio River, where others put the fort, might be a little bit more precarious of a location. Meanwhile, Andrew's group, when they got to Point Pleasant, they established a campsite there. And they were bringing livestock with them, and so their wing of the army was strung out pretty well. So it took a while for them all to get there, and meanwhile, Chief Cornstalk of the Shawnee, and he lived up around the area today we know as Circleville. He had a town up there, Cornstalk's town, and his sister, Non-Helena, referred to by British soldiers as Grenadier Squaw because of her large stature, and she was a warrior as well. She had a larger town. They were both on opposite sides of a creek up there. And apparently they had knowledge of this army approaching them, and they knew it was in two divisions, and so at some point, apparently Cornstalk and his sister and those in charge decided it would be best to fight one group first and then the other group later rather than fight them all together. And so they went down to the Ohio River, crossed upstream from the mouth of the Kanawha, and camped the night on the Virginia side, and were planning to surprise Lewis's army in the morning. However, he had Lewis had some fellas. They weren't happy with some of the decisions that were being made regarding the food and the meat. They were trying to feed people the dying cattle first, and people weren't happy with that. And so a couple of them decided to get up early and go hunting. And as they moved upstream looking for deer, they spotted some of the of Cornstalk's people, and so they were able to get back and provide some warning to Lewis's people before they were attacked. Anyway, the attack occurred. We're at the confluence of the Kanawha River and the Ohio River at Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Virginia at the time of the story of Dunmore's War. And this is the site where Cornstalk and his army of Shawnee and allied tribes attacked Lewis and his army that had come down from Camp Union along the Greenbrier and the New and out into the Kanawha here. And Dunmore was supposed to meet him at this location, and he did not. He stopped at the Hocking River and built a fort and headed north up the Hocking. And the Battle of Point Pleasant took place here at this location on October 10th, 1774.
You have chosen to go to war, then I will lead you. Together, the Shawnee, with the Miami, the Ottawa, the Delaware, the Mingo, we will come together as one army, as one body, that we may fight against the Dunmore and his armies. We know that he sends an army from the north, that he leads himself. We know that Lewis has left the great levels. I have warriors who have been trailing them, and they have sent messages back. They have stolen horses from their very camps. When they arrive at the place where the Kanawha and the Spilawithibi flow together, they will camp there. We will cross our army where the old village once stood. The English, they call it Old Town. It is our land. We will cross there. And during the night, we will make our way. We will attack from two sides. We will come in there before the sun comes up. We will catch them as they sleep. They will not have the sleep out of their eyes. We will attack them in their tents. We will drive them into the rivers. I have already taken and stationed the elders, the old men, the old women who can no longer fight. Across there, they are burning fires. And when the men swim the river to escape, they will be waiting with their war clubs, with their muskets. And when they rise up out of the water, we will strike them dead. We will destroy Lewis's army. Then we will go and we will meet with the Dunmore. and he will no longer come and want us to ask for a peace, for he will have to ask peace from the Shawana. For he will know we are a mighty people, that together we cannot be stopped, that they must go back across the Alleghenies, for they will have lost half of their army. They will be alone, and the Shawnee will be mighty once again.
Lord Dunmore led a division of the army down the Ohio with, and the numbers are always sketchy, but I've seen numbers from somewhere between 1,000 and 1,700 people in his division. And Lewis came down the Kanawha with, I've seen numbers between 800 and 1,500 people under his jurisdiction. And the numbers I've heard for the Shawnee were between 800 and 1,100. So they had the lower numbers there. Anyway, after a day-long battle at Point Pleasant, and Lewis's army was backed up to both the Ohio and the Kanawha River, so they didn't have the opportunity to retreat any. Anyway, at the end of the day, and as the battle went on that day, apparently Native Americans, when they had dead, they would pull their dead off the battlefield and either slip them into the river or secrete them somewhere. They would hide them so that Lewis's men didn't quite have any idea what level of success they were having in this encounter. But the numbers that seem to surface in this day and age, Lewis apparently lost approximately 75 dead and 140 wounded. And the Shawnee, 33 killed in battle, and 8 died later of wounds. And there's an unknown number of wounded with the Shawnee. So the Shawnee killed more than twice as many of the soldiers as the other way around. And because they didn't prevail on the day, they never got enough of an upper hand to take control of Point Pleasant. They then retreated across the Ohio River and headed back up toward Cornstalk's town and Grenadier Squaw's town. Pucksinwau was killed at the Battle of Point Pleasant. Pucksinwau is the father of Tecumseh. He died at the Battle of Point Pleasant, and Tecumseh's older brother, Chicksika, also fought at the Battle of Point Pleasant. Cornstalk's sister, Nanhalima, fought at the Battle of Point Pleasant. So but we have very little information about all the whole Native American perspective. And that's something we should look more into. Lewis claims victory, even though he lost more than twice as many men. And but he was also rather, upset's probably less of a word for it than he was. So his intent was to pursue them back and retaliate on his terms up around wherever he could track them down. Meanwhile, Dunmore's wing of the army, they had worked their way up the Hocking River, camping at Stewart, Chansey. And of course, we name these towns now. It was just wilderness at the time. There was no settlements in the Ohio country except Native American settlements, and they weren't down here so much as up along the Muskingum and the upper Muskingum around the Coshocton area and along the Ohio River and along the upper Scioto as well. But they camped at these places, Nelsonville, and then when they got up past Logan, they headed over out of the Hocking River watershed and into the Scioto River watershed. Lord Dunmore and his wing of the army spent a few days marching up the Hocking River from where it met the Ohio, camping out at some of the major stream crossings that they had to do that were tributaries at the Federal Creek and Sunday Creek and Monday Creek. And now they've they've reached the lower falls of the Hocking, and they have to cross the river. So, and you have to remember that this was a primeval forest at the time. The trees around here would have been centuries and centuries old, the average tree, and they had to make their way up the east side of the Hocking for several days now. But to get to their destination over in the Scioto Valley, the next major watershed to the west, they had to cross the Hocking River and then head up one of the tributaries to get over the watershed divide there so that they could head toward the settlements of Cornstalk and his sister Nyla. So at this point in the river, just above the falls, there would have been 12 to 1,500 militia soldiers with Dunmore coming across here. They probably did not have, they had no livestock, no horses or anything like that, because they had come down the river previously from the area around Pittsburgh, and they had built a fort down at the mouth of the Hocking called Fort Gower, and that's where they left their canoes and some supplies while they headed up this way into the wilderness. They must have had a Native American guide, because it's one thing to follow the river, but when you decide to cross the river and then head across country and head up over the next watershed divide, you probably need to know where you're headed ahead of time. It seems the easiest route would be up Clear Creek and then head up to the upper headwaters of Clear Creek and then cross over into the Scioto River watershed. Dunmore's wing of the army crossed the Hocking a short while back, and now 1,000 to 1,500 of his Virginia militia marched up this quiet valley, Clear Creek Valley today. They would have passed this large outcrop of blackhand sandstone that is common in this region of the state of Ohio. It was exposed after the glaciers of 10,000 years ago. So the army of 1,000 soldiers would have been finding themselves marching up these floodplains, and they would have had to make their way through large stands of this equisetum, or it's known as horsetail. It's a very ancient plant and doesn't have any leaves to it. It goes back to the age of the dinosaurs. And it's commonly found in the floodplains along the Hocking River and up this valley here. Would have made for a little tougher movement for the army. And they established a camp over there somewhere along today's Route 56 with the intent to have a treaty with the Shawnee. Cornstalk and his folks talked it over, and it seems that Cornstalk came up with two options. One of the options he offered to his people was, we kill all the women and children, and then we fight these people to the death. That was one option. The other option was, we accept whatever conditions of a treaty that they're willing to offer us. And apparently that's what they decided to do. So Cornstalk and his sister Nyla and others went over to the site where they had the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, which is located over on what's today Route 56 between Laurelville and Circleville. Well, here we are back on the trail of Lord Dunmore's War. We're at the site where this homestead is. Here is on the site of where they had the Treaty of Camp Charlotte in the autumn of 1774. The house behind us, the back end of the house, we just learned was built in the 1820s and the front end in the 1840s. And it's still in the same, it's been in the same family for 100 and some years. And it's on the site of where Chief Cornstalk and his sister Nyla Vollmer and the Shawnee met with Lord Dunmore and his officers and his militia to come to some agreements on how folks were going to relate on the Ohio frontier. And so here they had the Treaty of Camp Charlotte after the Battle of Point Pleasant that had occurred earlier in the autumn in October 10th of 1774, where Cornstalk and his sister and the rest of them fought. Tecumseh's father died there at the Battle of Point Pleasant, and so now they're here at Camp Charlotte to negotiate some resolutions to that conflict. So after the Battle of Point Pleasant, Colonel Lewis and his forces followed the Shawnee up the Sauda Valley, where they retreated to Cornstalk's town and Grenadier Squaw's town. The larger of the two was Grenadier Squaw's town, and that was Nyla Vollmer's town. I'm not sure exactly how the different organizations worked out, but there were two Shawnee towns up around the Circleville area, or actually straddling either side of the creek right around here. And reports say that Cornstalk was talking with his people, and they were really fearful of what the consequences of the Battle of Point Pleasant would be, and they had considered a couple of different options, and one was that they would kill all the women and children and then fight the Dunmore's army to the death, or the other alternative was to go to the treaty and find out what Dunmore was willing to offer. And so when they had the treaty, they were pleasantly surprised that it was a rather lenient proposal for the Shawnee. What they had to agree to was that they would quit causing depredations and attacks along the Ohio River and across the river into Kentucky and possibly Virginia. And Dunmore was really apparently trying to appease them so that should, in the not too distant future, a war break out between the colonies and England, that the Shawnee would tend to side with the British. And so they wanted to keep them on fairly good terms apparently, but I'm not sure that was understood by Cornstalk and his team. Cornstalk and his sister thought that was way more lenient than they were expecting, and so they agreed to that they would just control their warriors and agree to the terms of the treaty, which allowed, of course, the European settlers to move closer and closer to the Ohio River. And you know what that leads to is just continuing encroachment. So, and Logan, meanwhile, refused to attend this treaty, and so Dunmore sent some people to go see Logan. One of the people was a fellow named Gibson, which, as I understand it, was a brother-in-law of his, and I'm not sure if that means that Gibson's wife had been killed in that slaughter too. That's called the Yellow Creek Massacre, where Logan's family was killed. Anyway, they went to see Logan, found him underneath the spreading arms of a giant elm tree over there on the Pickaway Plains. This is a marker put up, around 1912 or so, to commemorate the speech made by Logan underneath the broad branches of the elm tree that used to stand directly behind where this stone is today. And they have inscribed the entire commentary in granite.
I appeal to any white man to say, if he ever entered Logan's cabin hungry, and if he gave him not meat, if he ever came cold and naked, and he clothed him not, during the course of the last long and bloody war, Logan remained idle in his cabin, an advocate for peace. Such was my love for the whites, that my countrymen pointed as I passed by, and said, Logan is a friend of the white man. I have even thought to live with you, but for the injuries of one man, Colonel Cressup, who last spring in cold blood and unprovoked murder the relatives of Logan, not even sparing his wife and children. There runs not a drop of my blood in any living creature. This has called on me for revenge. I have sought it, and I have killed many. I have fully glutted my vengeance. For my country I rejoice in the beams of peace. But do not harbor a thought that mine is the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not turn on his heels to save his life. Who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one.
This is a marker put up, around 1912 or so, to commemorate the speech made by Logan underneath the broad branches of the elm tree that used to stand directly behind where this stone is today. And they have inscribed the entire commentary in granite. Logan was a Seneca from upstate New York. His group was referred to as Mingo. He was known as the Mingo Chief, Mingo Warrior. His family was massacred along the Ohio River at Yellow Creek, roughly up around where Steubenville is today. And no members of Logan's family survived, and that called on him for vengeance, as he says, and he retaliated, and that bothered a lot of the folks over on the East Coast in Virginia who were looking at the Ohio country, at the Ohio wilderness, as a place for expansion of America. This stone is a marker memorial to Nyla, the sister of Chief Cornstalk, Shawnee. She was a Shawnee warrior chief and head of Grenadier Squaw's village, which was the larger village here in this on the Pickaway Plains in the Sauda Valley. She was referred to by the British as Grenadier Squaw because of her large stature. Also, she was a peacemaker and spoke 3 languages. This is a nice recognition to her by the women's group who were part of the Bicentennial Commission. Regarding Lord Dunmore's war, some of the things that are often focused upon are the Battle of Point Pleasant in October and the following treaty up north that Logan refused to join in on and gave his famous speech under the great elm. And those parts of the stories have lingered pretty well into over time. But the Fort Gower Resolves, what's that all about? And it's not likely that the militia and Lord Dunmore, certainly himself, they didn't come out here into the Ohio wilderness out on the edge of the frontier to make these declarations. But before they left, they knew what was going on in their communities, and they know what had happened. There was the proclamation of 1763 is one of the first things that got this thing started, because the British decided that settlers couldn't go anywhere west of the top ridge of the entire Appalachian Mountains, from way up in Maine all the way to the Gulf. And they weren't supposed to go past that. But there was nobody who went up there and marked that. And so that line was always being pushed, and it was being pushed in resistance to the Crown, who had made that decision. So there was that thing. And then there were some other impositions that the Crown made on local citizens. They passed the Stamp Act, where every piece of paper that they used for any kind of business or anything else, they put a tax on every piece of paper. It was amazing. And then there was another act where they put a tax on all kinds of daily usable items that you require, and China, and just everything that was part of your daily life. And of course, there were a lot fewer things that occupied a person's space in those days, and whatever it was, they were taxing it. And a few other situations. And then, due to some disruption, because the British were already over here in the colonies and establishing a presence, but they'd been here a while, and so the British were even involved in communities where they were staying, and there were relationships that developed, and so there was some more of a rough edge along the edge of the military boundaries too, and the communities. And at some point, over some altercation, we had what is known as the Boston Massacre in 1770, and five people were killed. And so, of course, the British are the ones who shot him, and so that was a problem. People see that as, the Crown, this is all these issues, they're taxing us without representation, they're doing this, and then you have the Boston Massacre. And then a few other things like that go on, and then they have the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. And that's just a few months before Logan's family is massacred on the Ohio River. So this is all in people's minds. They know about this kind of fervor that's flowing across the land. And then they came out here because Dunmore and Washington and some of these other people were looking at the land out here for expansion. Remember, Washington had been down the Ohio River just a few years earlier in 1770, scouting out, looking for land that they could award to veterans of the French and Indian War, because that war hadn't been paid off, and these guys hadn't been paid, and they risked their lives, and so they were wanting to pay them off with land. Of course, they were going to be taking Native American land away from them and giving it to soldiers, so that was already on a rough track. But in any case, they were looking at expansion here, and after the massacre of Logan's family on the Yellow Creek along the Ohio River, Logan retaliated. Lots of people were getting burned out and killed, and a lot of commotion on the frontier here. And others might have been at the time harassing people going down the river, settlers moving down the river, and so they were being harangued from the Ohio side occasionally. So there was some disturbance on the frontier here because of this move in. And you have to remember, the Native Americans were just pushed this way some years earlier. years and decades earlier when they got pushed further from the east into the Ohio country. That's why there were so many different groups here. And this part of the state, it looked like it was a lot of Wyandot and Shawnee. And so they knew what was going on back east and in the villages and communities they lived in, but they were headed west into the frontier, and that was to put down the retaliation that Logan had started. And so they did that. Some of them fought in a battle, some marched up the other side of the Hocking River, and after they met, some of the people who fought in battle came back down through Hockingport, or through the confluence of the Hocking and the Ohio, where Fort Gower had been built. And so some of them had survived encounter, a violent day-long battle with the Shawnee. They must have been feeling pretty good to have survived that, because some people didn't. And they've survived all these months living in the wilderness and living off the land and just living day to day as they traveled and covered many, many miles in the, in the Appalachian and Ohio wilderness. So they're probably feeling pretty good. And then they had a successful treaty, they thought, with the Shawnee, and that felt good. They had a successful treaty with the Native American tribes that were causing disturbance out in the Ohio country. So things are calming down. So they're feeling pretty good about that. And they're wondering, and may have gotten a little bit of information from the folks still at Fort Gower that stayed there to watch the canoes and supplies, probably had a little new information about some of the stuff going on back east with people's anxieties. And so here they are, and they have these leaders, these people like Daniel Morgan and George Rogers Clark, Colonel Crawford, Ebenezer Zane, some of these folks, and they're leaders, and they make this decision to pass these resolutions, and they all vote on it. And they made that resolution, the Fort Gower Resolves, two of them, of course. One, that they would defend the king and the crown against any insult or injury and protect its dignity at any point they could, as long as the king chose to rule over a brave and free people. But they said, have it go the other way, and because of the love of liberty and all the attachment to it thereof is so great, that they would defend the colonies against the crown. And that's significant. The other statement they made, the other resolution, was that Lord Dunmore, well, he was a right honorable fellow and a swell guy, and they believed that he made this trip out here to do this for no other reason for the betterment of his country. And I would imagine that one of the reasons that was included is because there was a lot of discussion going on about why did not Lord Dunmore continue on down to the Ohio River and meet Andrew Lewis as was previously planned. And a number of stories come out about why. And for whatever reason, Dunmore built his fort. And so there's some speculation by some that maybe Dunmore was setting up Andrew Lewis. He was a frontiersman. He had Virginians with him. They're coming down, and they get into this conflict with Shawnee, and here I am coming out here seeking peace. And so therefore gaining favor for the British, or for the crown, from the Native Americans as they increase their anxiety against the colonists, because he had set them up to do that. So the fellas in Dunmore's army, at least the officers, decided to make that statement as part of one of the resolutions. And it probably calls into question a little bit about all of it, the sincerity level. And there's another thing, you can get really excited when you hear about this declaration, an early declaration of independence from the crown 18 months before Jefferson made his Declaration of Independence. Matter of fact, this declaration that was made as a Fort Gower Resolve on the banks of the Hocking in the Ohio was printed in the Virginia Gazette in late December of that same year, a little more than a month and a half later. And Jefferson would have picked it up, and when he was reading the paper that day, to read the Fort Gower Resolves. And surely that would have been, he would have had to think about that, and it would have been part of his thinking over the next 18 months as he penned his. And you can get really excited about that, because wow, an early Declaration of Independence from right here in this neck of the woods. But then you have to think, independence for who? That's always been the issue, right? Is like, who gets the freedom and who gets the independence? And so for them to make this declaration out on the Native American frontier meant that the Native Americans were going to lose something. And a part of this story I believe that needs to be looked into further is the possible role, and the likely role, I would say, of the black community of the Eastern, of Virginia, that played a role in this somehow, either by a job or by being kind of pressed into that kind of work to help and to do some of the work of bringing this army down the Kanawha Valley, driving livestock, carrying stuff, making sure that weapons were moved and ammunition. And so you wonder, that's not a part of the story that's been discussed much, but it seems likely that that played a role, as the black community has in every engagement that has occurred in American history, one way or another. And so there's probably an early involvement there. By the numbers, I wouldn't be able to say, but it's a section of the story that needs to be looked into. And so the Fort Gower Resolves, they're an exciting thing. Declaration of Independence on the banks of the Hocking River in 1774. There are people who thought that that site down there where the fort was should be a national shrine. And these suggestions were made back in the 1940s by people who were aware of that lived in this region at the time. So it's important. It's an important story to learn more about and consider it as its relationship to other aspects of life and history at the time, because nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything's interconnected, and so somewhere along the line, where there's push, there's pull, and things, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and that kind of thing happens, and it happens out on the frontiers of the world all throughout history. And it was happening here in some of the early stuff, and it got worse in Ohio. And remember at the Battle of Point Pleasant, that's where Tecumseh's brother and father fought, and his father died there. So this is an important story in American history, and it's kind of gotten away from us in a fairly large way. There's things to be learned from it, and to assess it and to consider it, think about it, and talk about it more. There was a conference in 1974 up at the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus, Ohio, for the 200th anniversary of the Fort Gower Resolves and the story of America or the story of Ohio and the American Revolution. And that's a debate still too that a lot of people want to push forward. Was the Battle of Point Pleasant the first battle of the American Revolution? And I would say that personally, they didn't come here to defend the colonies against the king when they had the encounter with the Shawnee on the bank of the river there. They came out here for a different purpose. But the entire event, Dunmore coming into this part of the country and bringing the people he did with him and the experiences they had, so that when they got back to Fort Gower, those guys were talking. They were talking about the things that they had heard and remembered from going on back east before they came out into the wilderness, and their concerns about their families. And they've been talking. And then when they get back to Fort Gower, maybe they got a couple new tidbits of information and a little bit more of that energy that they got away from out in the wilderness. So whatever reason, they passed the Fort Gower Resolves, and this inspired other groups too, or I don't know if it inspired them. It probably was written up and they would have done it. So some of these other communities, Tort County in Virginia and Fincastle Resolves, there's a series of them that came following that pretty quickly. There may have been something before it, but they don't seem to have as much play that I've heard yet, but you never know. So at the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, Cornstalk and his sister and whatever members of the Shawnee group were involved, they had their agreement with Dunmore and his officers and his army, but that was not a signed agreement, and it was so it was an agreement in the wilderness between the Shawnee and Dunmore. And so the plan was that Cornstalk would meet Dunmore or his representatives in Fort Pitt in the spring. And here we are in late October, and they're talking about having Cornstalk and his group make the trip to Fort Pitt, where the Monongahela and the Allegheny come together to create the Ohio. And when they got there, it was such a bustling place. It was right on the edge of the frontier. It was highly populated with lots of people all in motion at the same time. And so when Cornstalk and his group met there, there was no Dunmore, there was no signing and finalizing of the treaty. So then Cornstalk, you know, he talks about the impact of this whole deal on his family and how much more land they've lost and more restraints on them along the river. And so he went back, and after a while, the things were continuing to rumble in the east, and the Shawnee were able to find out, and they were probably in communication with various representatives of different groups, the English, the colonies, etc., traders, whoever that was out there in the wilderness. And so they knew what was happening, and so at some point, apparently the Shawnee had decided in a council with Cornstalk and his sister and others, and they decided they were going to side with the British. And so Cornstalk, honorable, knows he made a commitment to Dunmore, and so he decides to go down to the Ohio River to Fort Randolph, which has been established down there, and announce to them that he knows he made this agreement on behalf of the Shawnee tribe, but the tribe times have changed, and the Shawnee tribe has decided to drift toward the British interest. And I just wanted to let you know. And so he was immediately taken into custody. And after a while, his son, Ellen Ipsico, came looking for him, and he was quickly apprehended as well. Meantime, off in another direction here in the Ohio Valley, some other encounters occurred, and some militia fella or pioneer fellas along the river were killed in an encounter. I don't know all the details or if Native Americans were hurt or the pioneers. But when they got back to Fort Randolph, they were very angry, and they immediately executed Cornstalk and his son. And so there's a marker there at Two-Ende Way Park at Point Pleasant, right there on the point with the stone dedicated to Cornstalk. And I could suppose it's his grave, you don't know. And then, of course, that was in the 70s, late 1770s, and now it's 2020s, and you know, all you hear about Cornstalk besides that marker there is his curse. You know, I guess he left a curse on the valley here, and so we've had things happen, like the bridge disaster down there. Some people attribute that to Chief Cornstalk. I don't think he was more of an honorable fellow than that from all historical information. But anyway, he's a figure that we could learn more from. We need to know more about how the people of that era thought and how they lived and how they interacted. You know, we only get the history that's passed down to us, and they say history is written by the victors, and so whose perspective was presented in that. And so there's a lot more to be learned, and this is an important thing to be doing, is be talking about it like this. And hopefully this initiates more conversation and more investigation so that we could just learn more. The more we learn about our past and the past, the better we have an idea of who we are and what it all means, and maybe what our responsibilities should be. And so anyway, I think it's always important to learn from history, because when we don't even know what it is to be an American. We've got to know what happened, how we got here. So they do the treaty or the Fort Gower Resolves. They head back up the Ohio River to Fort Pitt. Dunmore himself heads back to Williamsburg or wherever he originated. I think he might have been in Williamsburg. And so things continue on. We move closer and closer to the American Revolution, and at some point Dunmore offers amnesty or emancipation to any blacks who would leave their plantations and leave their indentured servitude and come and side with the British, and then they would be granted liberty after that. And some did, but that was Dunmore's, what he got into. He got into some other things as some of the stories go. At some point there's a story about Dunmore pilfering some gunpowder, and that gets around. And so at the same time he's supposed to be in charge, he's also maybe one of the little criminals running around. But anyway, after that, I don't know the whole story in the American Revolution, but he doesn't stick around very long. He quickly flees back to England and rejoins the royalty of his sector of the British Isles. We had a fellow come up here from Blacksburg, Virginia, who was born and raised in England. Came here in 1970, taught chemistry for an entire career at Blacksburg, Virginia. When he retired, he started doing local history in Virginia, and he discovered this story about the Fort Gower Resolves, and it's just really captured him. And so he was on his way to Columbus one day to give a paper at the Ohio History Connection back about 5 or 6 years ago, and he stopped at the Historical Society here to tell this story to us. And he said not only should every kid in Athens County know the story of the Fort Gower Resolves, he said every kid in America should know it, because what happened on the banks of the Hocking River is of national and international significance. He says, now look, I'm British. We were the bad guys. And November 5th that's our big day. That's the day we have fireworks and bonfires. That's Guy Fawkes Day. That's our big celebration day. And he said, that doesn't hold a candle to what happened on the banks of the Hocking River.
So I come once again to the place where the rivers come together, to the place that they call Fort Randolph. Captain Arbuckle, he's the leader there. He's a good man, and I've been there many times since the battle with Lewis and the peace that we've made with Dunmore. I will go there and I will warn him that I can no longer keep the Shawnee at peace, and we are going to go and we are going to fight on the side of the English. And I myself must flow like the river and go with them. They will, I'm sure, as an honorable man as he is, I can hope that he may let me go, but I expect I will be kept captive at the fort, much as we keep those in our villages. But I will come to him in peace. I will tell him, you need to take your soldiers and go back across the mountains, for we are going to war and we will fight against them. The rest of the story doesn't go very well for Chief Cornstalk. I go to the fort and I deliver my message of peace. It's really a peace message. He's still trying to keep that. He's trying to save Arbuckle and the men at Fort Randolph. As a result, Arbuckle makes a wise decision, keeps him captive within the fort. He's not tied up. He's not bound into a certain cabin. Journals of the men who are there have him moving about the fort, mapping out other things, talking to the men about the rivers and different things on down the Ohio. He's kept there for several days. His son, Elenipsico, he's been gone for so long, comes to the fort to see what has taken so long, because he's just delivering a message. During that time, some of the soldiers who had already gathered outside the fort, for they had already heard that the Shawnee were going to go to war. So they were amassing a small militia to go across and attack the Shawnee villages. General Hand was coming down from Fort Pitt. But during that time, a couple of men, against orders, go across the Kanawha to hunt. One of them is shot and killed by a party of Mingo, not Shawnee. Had nothing to do with Chief Cornstalk, El Nipsco, any of those. The men demand revenge. The only natives left or around were Chief Cornstalk, El Nipsco, his son, Red Hawk, a Delaware chief, and another one by the name of Petala. They were all within the fort. The men come to the fort. Captains Arbuckle and Stewart both tried to stop them, but they could not stop them. They basically told them, get out of our way or we'll kill you, then we'll kill the Indians. They come to the fort. They come to the cabin where Chief Cornstalk is. They shoot him with 7 to 8 musket balls. He falls dead. They rush the cabin. They kill El Nipsco. They kill Red Hawk. They kill Petala, who's trying to escape up the chimney. He's just hiding. He can't make it out the hole, but he's trying to hide. They drag him out. They kill all of them there. The men are arrested. They are brought before the courts, and they all go free because no one will come testify against them, because Chief Cornstalk led the men in 1774 in the Great Battle and the things that had happened before. And that's the way Chief Cornstalk met his end.